it was obvious that almost no matter what the House of Lords was saying in terms of the care of children who've come as minors on boats being received essentially as refugees, that MPs were determined just to flip the boat over, as it were, because their interest is in containing the number, not understanding the who.
I'm Leah, the founder of Broadstairs Consulting. We're a board advisory and mediation practice helping people thrive and flourish in crisis situations. Believing crisis isn't an if, it's a when. We want to help people disagree well and move forwards in challenging times. While we are unafraid of crisis, it's rare for one to be resolved in a single day. However long the day or night that gave rise to the crisis in the first place, there's always something we can learn. That's the genesis of The Longest Day. Our guests have overcome a litany of crises. Many have worked with us in some capacity in the past. All of them have stories worth hearing. We trust them to make this worth your while. We hope it helps you trust us. Lord Michael Hastings has had a deeply purposeful career across the public, private and non-profit sectors, working within education, philanthropy, justice and commercial business to support and develop communities around the world. He is currently the chairman of SOAS and the professor of leadership at the Stephen R. Covey Institute in the USA. He began his career as a teacher, then worked across government agencies on policies to build racial equality, including as a commissioner with the Commission for Racial Equality for 9 years. He is chair of the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Black Business Association and chair of the advisory board of the Black Business Institute. He was conferred with a CBE in 2003 for services to crime reduction, with a peerage to the House of Lords in 2005 as an independent baron. He is currently a vice president at UNICEF UK and a trustee for the Africa Philanthropy Foundation. We like to leave the interpretation of Longest Day up to our podcast guests, and this episode is a really refreshing twist. Well, Michael, it's a joy to have you buck your no podcast trend. Thank you so much for being willing to be interviewed today.
I try to avoid them, but you're so persuasive.
Well, I wonder if you might be able to tell our listeners about your longest day.
My longest day was full of pressure and beauty at the same time. And I remember it so vividly because it ended in a pub in Peckham where my very dear son, Kenny Imafidon, was launching his first book. Penguin have published That Peckham Boy. And he's been the writer 100%, but I have done the journey with him over the 6 years it's taken from the very, very, very first conversation we had with Penguin, right the way through to the publishing of the book, to the extensive travels we did around the world when he was sketching and writing and rewriting, to the long road journey we did in South Island, New Zealand, when I did the driving for 11 hours and he did the laptop working and writing and giving me ideas. And I'm trying to concentrate on these mountainous roads and hearing aspects of this incredible story. And now to see That Peckham Boy being right at the top of UK political books on Amazon purchasing, but also to see it there in foils, to see it there in Waterstones. And as I speak to Kenny daily, I get to hear, as we've done over the 10 years that we've walked on this journey together, to see him flourishing and telling a story that other people would think is so full of regrets, because of course it included incarceration, imprisonment. It included friends who are still in prison, and therefore questions about what kind of life were you living? And the honesty of that life is written out in full in That Peckham Boy. And it includes the pain of facing up to a family situation that had a stunning mother and a complex, unsupportive natural father, and having to resolve all of those tensions in the book so that what comes through it is something that Simon Sinek was willing to give a great quote on, Stephen M.R. Covey was willing to give a great quote, Bear Grylls was good, and I gave a great quote on. And so the book, it was the end of the evening. It had been a long and sweaty day, and the day had begun with a breakfast meeting in Parliament with one of the many men that I meet outside of their prison experience. So when they've completed their time, they get in touch. In this particular case, a man had actually come out of prison in 2021 and had taken 2 years to write to me to tell me he was free. In the course of those 2 years, he'd lost his mother, he'd lost very close family. His life had taken a nosedive emotionally. You'd think that freedom after a decade inside would be the greatest joy possible, but actually it became one of the most painful experiences for him. And he wanted to recover his equilibrium. We'd worked together as we do with all the prisons that we work in, Kenny and I and a number of others, all the prisons and all the prisoners we work with, who become friends. They're not numbers and names. They're very important people who we treasure and love deeply and see through the maze of whatever they've done. So a visit from him in the morning in Parliament where we could pick up on, wow, it's been 3 years since I last saw you, 2 years since you've been out, and where are you moving now? And the complexity that so many ex-offenders have to deal with. Government puts them out into the world with virtually no cash, with almost no support system, and especially if somebody's family is in medical or absentee turmoil. And then also just requires them to stand on their own 2 feet after a short space of time, and helping him to navigate now, all right, in the light of that and in the light of family distress that you've dealt with well, how can I support you? What's the best way to support you? You know what I've discovered from these incredible men, of which we have many hundreds that we work with inside and outside, is the most important thing that they need is continued hope and certainty of commitment. They don't ask for cash. They don't ask for jobs, although if we can help, we help. What they ask for is, can you be there? A sounding voice, a calm, centered person, a help. I'd gone from that to then a debate in Parliament on a piece of the government's legislation which I don't sit comfortably with, which was let's call it the immigration bill, Stop the Boats. It was obvious that almost no matter what the House of Lords was saying in terms of the care of children who've come as minors on boats being received essentially as refugees, that MPs were determined just to flip the boat over, as it were, because their interest is in containing the number, not understanding the who. There's a political gain in being able to say in the election period coming up, 2024, we stop the boats, as compared to saying we heard and understood the people who come here in travail and tragedy with pain and heavy cost. We don't see children paying hefty fees to traffickers. Obviously, families may well do that. But why do they send their children? Well, they send them because, of course, the dream of freedom and the dream of certainty and the dream of education, housing, food, water, electricity, stability, no conflict, no war. But getting that heard, the House of Lords is full of incredibly deep, wise, compassionate people who, irrespective of which side they sit on, they all concur together that there are inherent evils in rushing legislation that doesn't consider human rights at the core of its priority. That was on that day. I then went to SOAS, where I'm the chairman, School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, to launch a book about Nigeria's future. Big, hefty book. I think something like 400 pages. I didn't read it in advance, but I scanned the introduction and the conclusions. As chairman of SOAS, they wanted me to set the stage. I set the stage with a wonderful image, which was produced 100 years ago, which ironically shows China, India, and Africa as the big people of the emerging world, with small US, small UK, small France. This flip of identities. And I set the stage by saying we no longer doubt India's powerhouse presence. It's now the 5th largest economy in the world. We're now number 6. That's still a great place to be. out of 198 countries. Not bad to be still number 6. But for India, which we once thought of as just, well, bunches of people in rags pushing around little rickshaws, look at them now, sophisticated and owning even many of our industries, car production, some of the wealthiest people in Britain, business owners, technology leaders, incredible. On this very day, we're talking about this India seeking to land a probe on the moon. I mean, this is phenomenal. Phenomenal. My background, family background, is also from India. So I'm proud of this nation that is, with all its 1.3 billion people, has risen up to be a world economy of significance and stance and quality. Some questionable political attributes and behaviors, but they could say the same of us. They weren't very happy when we were the colonizers and they were the colonized. So we all have to take history as the great measures over millennia as compared to just saying how we feel right now. And, so there is China, there is India, there is Africa. And the one country in Africa that is the biggest and the most impactful is Nigeria. So to launch that book on that day was to say, Nigeria, come on, 200 million people, going to be 400 million people. How about you set the tone for Africa, for the continent, for its 54 countries? Unfortunately, the countries that are setting the tone are the smaller ones, the Botswanas, the Rwandas, and joyfully the Kenyas. But if Nigeria could grip itself and could pull itself away from everybody thinks, well, Nigeria is always just about corruption, misspending, misalignment, bad management, things don't get completed. Okay, maybe that's a bit of the story now. But people are energizing, entrepreneurial, committed, fantastically intelligent, highly educated, full of great ideas. So I did the launch at SOAS of the book, and then I dashed down to Peckham to Kenny's book launch. So that was my very long day. And I think the emotion of the day from the beginning, from a man who we'd known over the better part of 7 years and his release from prison, through to the launch of Kenny's book in the evening, and thinking that, what binds these two realities together is that for me, irrespective of my position and positions, the most important story for me is for those we can serve. And I love serving prisoners and ex-offenders, largely because the world despises them. And because the world despises them and the political class disregard them, and the more hardened of the political class, left and right, feel the best thing is to be tough and tougher and tougher still. And it doesn't actually stop the curse of crime. We have to learn how to change people's souls and spirits, to give them hope and to replace in them a deep desire for citizenship. Then we're winning.
That kind of activism is not born overnight. What is the journey that your career has taken you on that has enabled you to reach this people-focused, passionate desire to see society improve itself?
Well, my family have always said, you've never had a career, and I genuinely have never had a career. And I don't have a career. I just have roles and opportunities and things I do. I never set out as a late teenager at 18 before going on to college thinking, this is the line of sight for me. And it wasn't that. It was, it genuinely was having grabbed a purpose which I could articulate at 16 as to speak up for the poor and to bend the power of the prosperous to the potential of the poor, because I had vividly seen the impact of what poverty does when an economy collapses. I was in Jamaica before my parents then sent me to England to boarding school, and I saw with my own eyes how violence erupts in the streets when people lose their economic and social and personal anchors, and how a country rips itself to pieces. Used to be out of many one people, it became there's only one people. And I determined to speak up for the poor, to fight the case of those who don't have. And I realized that if I was to bend the power of the prosperous, in other words, those who have resources and position and influence, then I'm going to have to be in a place where I can exercise that influence. So I never planned to become a member of the House of Lords in the upper house of Parliament. I never planned that. There was no foresight of it. I got on with building relationships with people from the very first moment, which would lead ultimately to this gift. Mm-hmm. And what this gift has enabled me to do is to represent, to present and to represent. We still live in a world where when somebody uses the leverage of a title and a position and the access it affords, you can move needles forward, but you don't move them forward for yourself. You don't move them forward for fees and self-importance. You move them forward for those who cannot get their voices heard. And that came out of my teenage years. It came from my childhood observations. And it came from a deep ingrained desire that as I followed Jesus closely over the now 50 years, as I've followed him closely, I've learned more and more of his deep desire for the marginalized, for the people who everybody wants to stone and disregard, the ones who have to come out at the heat of the midday to get water because they're embarrassed by their lifestyle. But he sits and waits for them at the well and offers them a gift, which is refreshing, continuous, life-giving water. And because I've seen that in the scriptures and because I've felt that in my bones, therefore I feel, God, you've allowed me to have this position, this platform, this place where I can exercise justice. You are, at the end of the day, the one who is the Lord of all justice. But if I can do a little bit to advance the freedoms of others, to set people free, Jesus said in Luke chapter 4, the great mission that was before him. And I love the phrase, the way it's translated in one of the versions of the Bible, to proclaim the year of the Lord's acceptance. And the more we dig into the complexity of society, the more we realize there are so many people who feel rejected, not accepted, not wanted, not desired. And I want to do anything I can to open up the acceptance that allows them to be free.
Are you feeling stuck? Has conflict got you down? Have you considered mediation? Mediation is a confidential and flexible way to resolve conflicts. 86% of all mediations end in a solution, saving time, money, and stress for all involved. Thanet Mediation Centre, a Broadstairs consulting initiative, offers mediation services to individuals and organisations in Thanet, Kent, and further afield. For more information or advice, email us at info@broadstairsconsulting.com. We are here to help you move forwards.
Most people who lived a day like your longest day would lack the emotional resilience to shapeshift through different walks of life. What have you learned about yourself that has enabled you to be effective in all walks of life?
I think what I've come to treasure, put it that way, in this non-career life, show me an opportunity, ask me to do it and I'll have a go. I think what I've come to see is that I need, and I believe we all need, but I need my quiet meditative space first thing in the morning. I need my 5 o'clock space. I came to find that space in my teenage years and I have kept it. It's very rare that I'm not up and about at 5 o'clock. It's very rare that I'm not sitting down with a decent coffee by 5:10. I need the time to read. I read the news. I read the papers. I read the Financial Times. I read the Times. I read The Economist. I read Time Magazine. I read the BBC website. I read the Sky website. I read so that I can...
You sound like me.
Well, you're the best. I read so I can think. And I read so that I can pray better. And I read so I can be aware. And I read so I can pass on things. And I store stories. I find interesting things and I keep them. And I highlight them and I flag them and I record them. And then I want to find the face of Jesus every day. And that means looking for him in the written word that he's given us. whether it's from the Psalms in the Old Testament to a text from one of the books of the Old Testament into the letters of the New Testament. And for me, it's so important to know that Jesus was imprisoned before he was crucified, that he died instead of someone who was imprisoned and was there for a murder he had committed, but Jesus was murdered in his stead. And it was so important to know that Paul, as we like to call him, the Apostle small a, as it is in the Greek, Paul wrote most of his letters to us, having himself been a murderer and a terrorist. Finding Jesus, he wrote his letters from prison. So this story of encapsulation is deep within the scriptures. The story of Joseph in the Old Testament, who is imprisoned before he can eventually become, as it were, the king to set a country free. The story is all the way through. And I'm encouraged as I sit and I read, I pray, I seek to listen. I learned so long ago that listening to the voice of God is 1,000% possible as long as we listen. And listening means listening. Then I must hear, which means it enters my decision space. And then I must heed, which means I will go step out and do. And that is how I get the emotional wherewithal to go through a long day that is full of people challenges, preparations, planning. Every time we work now in 6 different prisons, and every time we do a prison visit, and we do them on a cycle of every 2 months. Every time we do a prison visit, there's so much admin involved in the doing of it. Individual relationships with governors, clarification as to what they think they're wanting or expecting, what we're saying we feel is the next step, sorting out securities, different people we take in to be part of that experience over a 3-hour period, the long journey to be there, the long journey to get back. Probably the highest level of emotion of all of our days, my days certainly, are these prison visits, because you find whether it's 50 men in the room or it's 150 men in the room, they all have something they want to say to us, and they want to be connected. And they often bring letters, and they come and whisper things in your ear, and they tell you, I need to talk about my case, and they try to involve you in their detail. But other times they're just so grateful. And in their gratitude, they lift my spirit. But then the emotion that's involved in it is overwhelming. Absolutely overwhelming. It's not clinical. It's deeply overwhelming, and it leads to an awful lot of follow-up that must be done. So you need a huge amount of purpose to do that. You can't do it if it's just, here's a date, here's a venue, go talk. No, it's got to be share life.
I love that exhortation to hear, heed, and do. We all know that one can't go far alone. So how do you advise the many, many young leaders, particularly Black leaders, that you take under your wing to find their tribe so that they don't have to go alone?
You know, the individualism that seems to be embedded in the British African, British Caribbean communities doesn't really reflect, actually, the communitarianism that is to be found in the Caribbean islands and the African nations. There's been a sort of shedding of that dimension of our cultural past, I think largely because of having to stand and make our way, whether they were the Caribbeans who came here through the Windrush period or the Africans who came here through the 80s into the 90s. It hasn't to be a make your way. You know, the people that Idi Amin threw out of Uganda had to come here, make their way. Africans who had to turn up to find somewhere to live in a council estate so they could work in the NHS or to run a bus. Make your way. There wasn't a wholesome community to enable. But that individualism is what is the curse that entraps our communities. And we have to now learn how to share our deep desires for advancement by actually bonding and building and empowering. So what I seek to teach them is they need each other, need to be aware of each other, need to understand each other's skills, need to deploy those skills with each other. They need to support. If one is winning, we're all winning. This philosophy of seeking the win of all, one of the critical principles Stephen Covey teaches in the 7 Habits is seek win-win. In other words, the win is not what I get. The win is what happens to us. That go together is what allows us to go far. But you can only get them to think like that and get them to move like that if you're willing to invest the time to help them to bond, but you bond with them. And I think the joy for me of these years of supporting and mentoring and enabling and being part of their stories, and Kenny so beautifully writing about in his book, and his story is only beginning. I got to say that, the second book, the third book, who knows? We might do it together, one of them. But when I think about all their stories, I think about how they've often come with a shield, and they've learned to let the shield fall away so that they can find in one another strength and understanding, work together, invest together, put resources in together, make visions turn into mountainous opportunities because they're practical. And the principle more than anything else is I always take them back to what Jesus said as most fundamental to all of our lives. If you really want to have a life that matters, give it away. And if you want to have a life that is indulgent, you hang on to it. You can get your own life, but it won't be very valuable. Or you can give your life and it will be momentous.
I love that. Last quick fire question. I don't know where in your longest day you would have found time to do this, but if you had to live that day again, what food would you choose to fuel it?
Well, one of the great delights about the catering in Parliament, most of the cooks, certainly in the House of Lords, I don't often eat down in the House of Commons, but certainly in the House of Lords, most of them are African. and most of those who are front of house are also are African. And therefore we do get very cultural food experiences. I have to say, given the choice, we genuinely do get jollof rice, but I won't say which of the 3.
And I won't ask.
But we genuinely do. And we get some very good peri-peri chicken. And we also get phenomenal salad and vegetables. So I'm very happy with the fact that we are culturally sensitive, genuinely inclusive, and high quality.
That's wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and giving a little bit of a flavour of what it's like for you to be in the House of Lords.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to a Broadstairs Consulting Limited podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Tune in soon to hear the next instalment of The Longest Day. Copyright 2023. Production copyright Broadstairs Consulting Limited. All rights reserved.